Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name's Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB, and I'm pleased to bring you tonight's webinar on worm control in Youngstock. Our presenter this evening is independent sheep consultant Lesley Stubbings. Lesley is also a very active member of the SCOPS. And the plan of action for this evening is that Lesley will take you through a 35-minute presentation, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, or at any time throughout the presentation, if you think of a question, then please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see this box, you may need to click the orange arrow to open this box up. When Lesley has finished presenting, I can then ask her these questions. So there's over 280 people registered for the webinar this evening, so hopefully we won't encounter any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So I'll now hand over to Lesley for this evening's webinar.
Thank you, Chloe, and good evening, everybody, to this what is more and more a normal occurrence, I think, in our lives at the moment. I hope everyone's safe and well. So this evening I'm going to talk a bit about worm control in Youngstock. As probably all of you know, I'm a sheep consultant, really, so but I will mention the cattle word now and again as we go through. Much of it is common, of course, with calves and lambs, but lamb worm control does tend to probably be higher on our agendas. So I hope you'll bear with me that a lot of my photographs are actually sheepy, but I will draw those conclusions or those parallels whenever I think it's appropriate. Okay, so if we think about lamb, i.e. and/or calves, in terms of what's going to affect their growth rate, there are obviously a lot of things other than worm control, which we're not going to talk about tonight, but which can also impinge on how they react and how badly worms are going to affect them. Something that many of you have heard me talk about before is nutrition and body condition, of course, and I'll mention that again in a minute, but how good a start in life a lamb gets is going to set it up as well for how well it can cope with the challenges later on. Pasture quality and quantity, clearly, and I will mention a little bit more about that in passing, relative to worm control mainly, but clearly their nutritional level is going to be important. Genetics are going to play a role, trace elements is going to play a role, yes, and things like cobalt deficiency particularly will have an effect on whether or not lambs can withstand and start to build their immunity. Health generally, and then of course we've got worms. So a lot of things are going on, and at the beginning of this I really just wanted to make the point that, you know, we really need to know something about the growth rates that we want if we want to judge whether or not our management and or our worm control is really at the level that we want it to be at. So this is just a very quick plea before we get into worm control for you to start thinking about what your targets actually are and what constitutes good. And it will vary from farm to farm and flock to flock. The sorts of benchmarks that we use, though, are that at 8 weeks, if lambs are growing at 300 grams a day, so that plus their birth weight, we would expect them at 8 weeks, 56 days, to weigh round about 20 kilos. 300 grams a day is not rockets in terms of growth rate, but it is a good growth rate. And so if you log that across a flock, we're looking for an average of 20. But again, the point to be made is that the animals that are below that 20 are the ones that we're losing performance and losing profitability on. And these are the ones in worm control context as well we want to be having a good look at. And similarly, up to 90 days then from that 8-week point, we're looking to try and maintain 300 grams a day, and the same applies, but we're looking for around about 30 kilos as a target weight at that point. But it's at that point between 8 weeks and 90 days that things tend to start to really level off. In fact, if you look at a lot of data on lamb growth rates at that stage, I would describe it as they often pancake, and we really are losing growth rate. And of course, one of the main factors there is at that time, between when lambs are about 8 weeks old to up to 12, 13 weeks, the challenge for worms is growing. So it is quite a big factor, but I would encourage you to at least weigh just a group of lambs just to know where you are. Okay, so having made my little plea for some benchmarks and knowing what the great growth rates are, let's have a look at worm control. And what is it we actually want from good worm control? I've got a few ideas in this next slide. You may have some more, and you're very happy. I'm very happy for you to bring other things into the discussion at the end if you wish. But obviously we want high lamb growth rates. That is really important, and we've already made the point that do we know what we're aiming at and or what we're actually achieving? Efficiency is all about growth rate when it comes to lamb performance. We want it to be cost effective, and historically anthelmintics have been cheap, so we have relied on them quite heavily and they've worked pretty well. But of course the world is changing, which we'll come to. We want it to be relatively uncomplicated. And I think this is where some of the sustainable principles that we now talk about, hand on heart, yes, they are more complicated than just drenching lambs every 3 to 4 weeks, unfortunately. But we can make some of the changes, don't have to be that difficult. Some of it is relatively simple, straightforward, which I hope I can bring out tonight. So regular patterns were easier, but we want it to be sustainable in the long term. We are losing some of the original anthelmintics. We're getting more and more resistance, so we have to look after them perhaps better than we were doing. So reducing our reliance on them is really important, and I'll look at some of the ways that we can do that over the season. So if we look at a typical annual infection pattern, and this has got sheep and lambs on it, but it would be a similar picture for calves, except obviously we wouldn't be having the same issue with eggs being dropped by their dams if they're dairy cattle, for instance. But what we're finding then is that as you come into the spring, in sheep we've got eggs dropped by the ewes. These are then picked up by the lambs when they become infective larvae, and then the lambs themselves start to drop eggs. And we're looking at this crescendo of infection on the pasture by the time we get to the second half of the season. And it's at that point that really we're trying to look for some evasive strategies, how we can actually dodge that great big mountain of infection for those lambs and or calves at that point there. So what we're trying to do, what I really want to walk you through tonight, is see whether we can reduce the impact of worms with treatments, but by targeting those treatments using fecal egg counts specifically, and also whether or not we can reduce that challenge. Now, if this will work for me, I'm not sure it's going to. No, the video won't come up. No, not to worry. Just go back to that one just a second. So yes, it will. There we go. So in the video here, this was really just it's a nice little video of lambs grazing, but these are really very young lambs and they're grazing away quite merrily. And it was just to make the point to you that, those lambs are grazing a pasture which has sheep in year out. It's a paddock at the back of me that's always used for the sort of the casualties and so on. Nematodirus, of course, is a risk, but also now is a good time for you, those of you who've got March-born lambs, to be thinking about starting to do some fecal egg counting, because they have been grazing for quite a while. And once they've been grazing for about 3 weeks, then obviously there will be some adult worms there. So it's really just to make that point. Okay, in terms of cattle, what we're really talking about, and suckler calves in my experience are really a relatively low risk as far as worms are concerned. And the main reason for that, of course, is that their stocking density as youngsters is relatively low because their dams are alongside grazing and their dams are just really good hoovers. Everything they eat, the worms will meet their immune system and they really won't go very far. So with suckler calves, I would certainly recommend that in the second half of the season you have a look at some fecal egg counts, but it's unlikely that you're going to need to take any action in terms of roundworms. It really is the dairy bred, the first season dairy calf, that's the one that we're looking at. But it may be, and sometimes with dairy bred cattle, you can find that even in their second grazing season, if they haven't met much of a worm challenge first time round, you may need to keep an eye on them as well. Okay, so the question I have really is, can we improve worm control? And I've deliberately used the word improve because I think there are many people out there who think that all this newfangled Scots principles trying to make life more complicated also involves an element of risk and compromise in terms of the level of worm control. And I just want to reassure people that actually that's not the case at all. I certainly don't take any chances with my clients' worm control. And what we're aiming to do is actually make it better. And one of the ways we could do that with using fecal egg counts, of course, is we can make sure that when we do treat, we treat at the right time for the right reason. And that can really enhance worm control. But at the same time, try to reduce our reliance on those treatments. So the two things coming together, they're not mutually exclusive. In terms of fecal egg counts then, many of you will be aware of this, I'm sure, but I think it's really important, 2 points here, that we understand what a fecal egg count is, we understand what a fecal egg count isn't, and then I'm just going to come on to how to take a good sample for a fecal egg count, because a bad sample is worse than no sample. If it gives you a misleading result and you act or don't act, for example, on that misleading result, then that's when things can start to unravel. And it's really very sad from my point of view when I do hear of those stories where people have, with all their best will in the world, have taken fecal egg counts and had a bad experience. So let's take that from the top then. What's the fecal egg count? Here we've got our worm life cycle in front of us. Takes between 2 and 12 weeks. That's largely temperature and humidity dependent. So at the times at the moment where things are warming up, some of us fortunately have just had a bit of rain, things will be speeding up. And most of the time we're probably looking at the moment around about 3 weeks as that cycle dries up again. It'll go a bit longer, but around about 3 weeks. So our lambs are eating grass. There we are on the right hand side with our little wavy little fur little bits of larvae in that nice little drop of water on the grass. They will eat those. They will then take 16 to 21 days to actually develop into adults, and then around we go, out come the eggs into the dung and through a couple of stages in the dung, and then they migrate up to the top of the grass again and wave around waiting to be eaten. So what a fecal egg count is doing is counting the number of worm eggs in the feces, and you'll see this phrase EPG, eggs per gram. So again, what that's really doing is telling you how many adults are in that lamb, and that's important. Remember, that's the number of adults that are in the lamb. It's not telling us that much about how much infection is on the pasture on that day. It's telling us what's actually in the lambs. So it's an indication of the number of adults in that sheep. And it will help us determine the need for a treatment, and we'll come on to looking at using them for testing the efficacy of the treatment as well. So that's what it's doing. What it's not doing, it's not a diagnostic tool, it's a monitoring tool. And I think a lot of people perhaps do the odd fecal egg count and want it to tell them in isolation whether or not they should be treating. It's really important, if you get into this, that you do a series of fecal egg counts so you can see what's happening over time. And I'll explain why just in a second. Because whilst it's an indication of the adult worms, it's showing you how many larvae on that piece of grass there that animal ingested 2 to 3 weeks ago. So it's historical. And you've got to really interpret that fecal egg count in that context. So, for example, if I was taking some FECs now from some lambs that are maybe, say, 6, 7 weeks old, and it came back and it was relatively low, and I was scratching my head thinking, but I know this farm, I know that field's going to be dirty, it's had sheep on it last autumn, we would expect there to be worms. I'd also be thinking, yeah, and you know what, probably 3 weeks ago it was very dry, there wasn't very much happening, but now we've had some rain. I would expect that pasture to be a lot more infected in another now, and my count to go up in 3 weeks' time. So I would be thinking, I need to recheck that in a couple of weeks. And it's putting it into that context as to how you can use a fecal egg count rather than it's only a low EPG, don't need to do anything, I'll look again in 3 to 4 weeks, because that can then obviously be a bit too late. So we must interpret them in the context of the farm and the sheep they apply, that they're applied to. It's really important that you think of it as being a monitoring tool and not a one-off diagnostic tool. Now, taking a good fecal sample, as I've said, is really important, because if you don't, you can end up with a false result. So 2 or 3 things here. I think we might have a little video here as well. So when you're actually taking it, you need it to be representative of a group or a mob. Now, you can either, and sometimes when you send it to the lab or the vet, they're really good, and you can send 10 individual samples in, and they will then subsample those and turn them around and give you a mob sample. That's fine, and that will mean that each animal represents the same bit of the overall composite, as we call it. But if you're going to send in a mixed sample, it's really important that you make sure that you take the sample at random and it's the same size from each of the animals. They've got to be fresh as well. And I would always say, you can see I've got a glove on my right hand there, and I always do the warm test. If it's not warm, I don't want it. So, you know, you can go around, as long as it's warm, take it, and it'll be fine. And as we said, equal sized samples. And you can either put them in the corner of the field and just hold them quite loosely for a while and walk away, and then go and pick some warm samples up. Or if it's young lambs this time of year, to be honest, that can be a bit of a thankless task, because you've almost got to go first thing in the morning. As they get up and stretch out, they poop out the back end, and then beetle off up there and get them. But just make sure that they are fresh. Okay, and there are quite a few options to be able to get fecal egg counts done these days. I'm not sure that there's a DIY. You can use a FEC pack, a generation 1 or generation 2. Some people will get themselves a microscope and use a McMaster slide, and there's also another system now called a mini flow tack. If you Google that, you can find, at the moment, they're made in Italy, so I don't think we can get those at the moment, but they are very accurate, and I've not used one myself, but I'm told they're really quite easy to use as well with a microscope. You can use a vet practice, of course, with the added advantage there that you're also going to get some help and advice and interpretation. The merchants also now increasingly are doing fecal egg counts. A lot of them are also using FEC packs to do that, so they're a good source of fecal egg counts. And there are commercial labs, APHA, SRUC, etc., BioBest, people like that. They are all offering services as well. So good access nowadays compared to 5 or 10 years ago to fecal egg counts. And the same would apply to cattle as to sheep, but you know, the same principles in terms of taking samples. Now, after doing that, it's important to choose the right product. And there are a lot of products out there, but the sorts of questions to ask is, what's the target parasite? And we'll come on to resistance status at the moment. Now, we have a lot of good sources now for, this is the STOPS one. I've just clicked through to it on the website. This was updated. I did this in January 2020. So they're all there, they're all in the groups, and it's easy to see where you're going with that. And similarly, this one should come up. This is the AHDB guide, which has got all the cattle and sheep ones in, so you've got them all together as well, so you can look at what there is. But it's really important just to remind you that you really need to target the right product at the right time. And one of the big issues here is avoiding combinations. So fluke and worm, particularly, either you're worming or you're fluking. Don't hedge your bets and do both if that's not what you need, because that's putting pressure on those products for resistance. And also using persistent products responsibly. So in the sheep world, that's going to be moxidectin, of course, and we've issued some new guidelines on the use of that in conjunction with the manufacturer. In the cattle world, I guess you're looking at your autoworm type products. And again, what you've got to bear in mind is that you need to use them carefully, because they work very well, but use them responsibly, because it can backfire on you in terms of selection for resistance. So avoiding that inadvertent use, really important. Combination products, classic, but also the endecticides, of course. So if we're using endecticides for sheep scab, then we've got to be aware that we're also worming that sheep, and we need to have that in our minds when we're then choosing our wormers. And similarly with liver fluke, and using a narrow spectrum product for that rather than a combination. Now, at the risk of teaching granny to suck eggs, I am going to just mention making sure we give the right dose, and mainly in the context of that, not that you don't know this, but it is often mistaken for resistance. And if we don't get the dose absolutely right, and we then go into using a fecal egg count for a drench test for testing for resistance, then it just completely blows the whole exercise, because you'll find you've still got an egg count down the line from your treatment, but if it's because, it may well be because they just didn't get a full dose. So let's just recap on it very quickly. Weigh the animals. The dose rate's really important to weight. Dose to the heaviest. If there's a big split of, a big divergence in weights across the group, consider splitting them into two. Make sure we get the right dose rate. Calibrate the gun. I know, because I do it all the time, that these guns go out of calibration really quickly. And if you're doing a lot of sheep in the morning, you will need to calibrate it a couple of times at least to make sure it's still on song and doing it. And you can see there, I've just got a big syringe and I just stick my thumb over the end of it. We don't need anything more fancy than that. And then make sure you administer it properly. So over the back of the tongue, really important, particularly for the 1B's edge, the whites, and for the macrocyclic lactones, 4AD and the 5SI. For the yellow ones, still do it, but it's slightly less important because they work so quickly. They don't need quite the contact time. Just to give you an example then, at the bottom, you know, if we were to have an animal and we got that dose rate wrong, so we thought it was between 36 to 40 kilos rather than 41 to 50, then we're giving 80% of the dose. If the gun is at 10% inaccurate, a lot of the time they're more than that, and then we work that through and we lose another 15% by a poor dosing technique, we quickly get down to less than 2/3 of the effective dose that they really should have received going into that animal. So the little increments add up and we end up with a less than effective dose. So one of the other things about fecal egg counts is to make sure that the anthelmintic we're using is effective. And testing for resistance is really important. And for those of you on tonight who've not been doing fecal egg counts before and are probably thinking, oh God, no, now she's talking about monitoring and doing them regularly, I would really encourage you that if you've not done them before, that this is the first thing that you use them for. And so what we're doing is we've got our lamb there on the left. He's got a mixture of worms. The red ones are the baddies, they're the resistant ones, and the green ones are susceptible. And if you get one that's got both, that's heterozygous, the right dose rate will kill those as well. We then drench them with whatever we've got. You can see I've got a white drench in that particular gun there. Then any worms in there that are resistant to that white drench will still be alive. It won't kill them. So we can then go back again for a white drench 14 days later and test the feces to see if we've still got an egg count. Now, enhancing that is, oh, I don't know why that's done that. Stop. Enhancing that is taking a test at the beginning as well to find out how many were there in the first place, drenching, going back 14 days later, take another test, and then away we go. We've actually got what we call a drench test, and there I am just testing to make sure that's a nice warm sample before we pick it up. The interval's 14 days for all of the worms apart from the yellow ones, which is a 7-day interval before you go back. And that really can be a brilliant starting point. We're not saying you have to wait for that result to come back to drench. It's up to you. The worst that can happen is you find that actually there wasn't much of a worm count and you didn't need to bother drenching in the first place, in which case you might just feel a little bit more inclined to get the result the next time. But that's the worst that can happen. No, I don't want you to do that. Thank you. Move on. I'm not going to. Come on, move on. That's it. So the reason for that, of course, is that you might say that, well, you know, if the worms weren't working, I would know. But bear in mind what we were talking about just at the beginning, which was growth rates, and the fact that actually we probably often, a lot of us don't have enough information about growth rates. What happens with antibiotic resistance is it's insidious. So just looking at this graph here, where we've got the number of resistant worms building over time, you will notice when you get into the red zone, because actually, do you know what? You'll be drenching, you'll be thinking about 10 days later, you'll be thinking, well, that's not done any good. I've got lambs that are really, really dirty and are going off. But for years, your wormers will be in that amber zone. And the thing is, if we can spot it in that amber zone, we can then switch to a product which is fully effective and you get the benefit of your lambs doing well. But the second thing is we can also demonstrate to ourselves that resistance is there and we need to be careful. We need to slow it down and take some of the pressure off it. But really about lamb growth rate, and equally with calves as well, although as you're probably aware, resistance in cattle isn't quite the level of problem that it is in sheep at the moment, but it is there and we need to be careful. So instead of waiting till we get our lambs there at the bottom where clearly there's a problem, we can actually look at them when they apparently look healthy. Alongside doing some growth rate monitoring, we can show ourselves that, well, that slippery slope is beginning to nibble away at our lamb performance. And just an example here, you know, we've got a pre-treatment here. Let's say we had 500 eggs per gram, and then here we've got, if it's successful, we're looking for a 90% or more kill. We would have less than 50 on the retest. We might have 100, which is suggesting, well, we're on the slippery slope. But if it was greater than 250, then it's suggesting that actually we've got a problem. Okay, so telltale signs of resistance might be an issue. Probably already too late in terms of making keeping that particular group of anthelmintics alive. But if any of these resonate with you, you know, I really would urge you to go and do some testing, some simple testing this time. So finding it difficult to finish lambs could be due to lots of things, but it may be that the wormers you think are working aren't working as well as they were. Too many stores left in the autumn, having to worm more often. I find this is quite a common one where people say to me, oh, blimey, my worm is not lasting for 3 weeks now, I'm having to go in sooner than that. And that for me is a real alarm bell moment. Having to buy lots of trace elements, drenches and boluses. Now, I know some people have trace element deficiencies, etc. But again, as an industry, you spend an awful lot of money on these things. Do you really know that that's the issue? Have you checked that maybe your worm control isn't as good as you thought it was? Okay, so just coming back to this then, the other thing that we can use fecal egg counts for, and for me is probably equally as important as the other two, is that we can begin to actually track how this big hummock of infection is going, because we're looking at how many eggs, this red area here, and what our fecal egg count is doing is telling us what's being dropped on the pasture in that red heap. And it's also then pointing us to the direction that actually we're following that along and we want to try and avoid this beast here if we possibly can, because even with regular treatments, that is going to slow lambs down. So what are our options? We haven't got time tonight to go into huge detail, but let's just run through one or two of the things that we can do. So we can alternate grazing with cattle or vice versa. You can tell I'm a sheep person, can't I? So if you cattle, particularly the dairy cows, obviously, then you could alternate grazing with them because the worm species are not interchangeable. We could look at things like bioactive forages. I think, you know, the chicory story is a little bit grey and fuzzy around the edges these days, but actually in terms of there being a cleaner, newer pasture, the nutritional advantages also have a role to play. We can avoid the main challenge by, and we can use weaning as a tool here, swapping with cattle again, using aftermaths, the old adage, but I've got a bit of a warning on that in a minute coming up. Some of you will guess what that is. And we can also look at things like forage crops to be able to move off those pastures and give our lambs a low challenge. I'm avoiding using the word clean, because clean these days is just something that really is very difficult to achieve, but very low challenge. And at that time, of course, with good nutrition, they're also beginning to develop their own immunity. One of the things, and we could perhaps come back to this again in questions, I know I get asked this one usually, is, rotational paddock grazing, has this any effect on worm control? The jury's out, basically, guys. And obviously it has an effect done right in terms of the nutritional quality of the grazing, keeping that grazing in the sweet spot and the dry matter allocation where we need it to be. From a worm life cycle point of view, you might think it's going to actually reduce it, and it may, but depending on what the life cycle is doing and the timing that that's taking to go around, and the number of paddocks and the time it's taking you to rotate, you could actually just be putting your lambs back into a hooking paddock if those worms have all come as infected larvae since the last time you went round. So it may be, it could be either way. We could pick that up in discussion if you wish. And of course, we've also got to be very, very careful that we don't actually practice the old dose and move. So here's our lamb again with his mixed population. We're probably going to wean him, and traditionally we would have treated him. We would have given him a drench, and then we would have ended up with, if there were resistant worms, just the resistant ones left alive. And if we at that point are moving that animal onto a very low risk pasture, the old, in inverted commas, clean, of course what we're doing is just seeding it down with resistant worms, and we've really got to avoid that. That is one very quick way to get serious resistance. So this is why we would say at that point, either treat your lamb on the left and leave him where he is for 4 or 5 days, and then he picks up a few mixed worms and takes them with him, or you could leave the best animals undosed and then only dose maybe 80 or 90% of the lambs based on weight gain and put them onto the new pasture. There's a third way which some people might do, and that is to move them all and then drench them a few days later. But I think from a practical point of view, that can actually be a little bit more difficult. I'm not quite so keen on that, but I wouldn't rule it out. We can look at forecasts. Obviously, at the moment, we've got Natidaris forecast running on the website. Natidaris hasn't been too much of a problem this year, and we're past probably the peak in the lowland areas now, but the hill and upland areas, look out, because I suspect your lambs will be just at the right age when this actually comes to be a problem. So just a little bit of a plug for that. Have a look at our website. And again, looking at the risk in terms of different fields at different times. Developing immunity is also very important. And one of the other reasons why it's good to not be using too much anthelmintic, and why we've got to be quite careful where we've used persistent wormers one-on-one all the time. And this can happen particularly with these dairy calves. If they've had a persistent bolus wormer, then what you're looking at then is delaying the onset of immunity, which by 4 to 5 months of age, we would expect lambs certainly to be kicking in, and all being well with calves, by the time they go out for their second grazing season, they should have some immunity as well. So bear that in mind. It's a really important part of what we're trying to do. They do acquire this immunity, and adult animals particularly are not only are they immune, the ewes, but later on in the season, if you've got a pasture that you've been monitoring and you know that you've had an awful lot of eggs drop down on there, post-weaning, your dry ewes can actually go in and they can give them a really good headache and clean a lot of them up, and actually not clean the pasture completely, but they will reduce the risk for later on or next season. So bear that in mind. But it's also dependent on their general health and whether or not they have a challenge. So sometimes I think, particularly when you perhaps get some animals that have been been to lots of shows, and obviously they've been wormed quite regularly, they're perhaps young ram lambs or whatever. You've just got to be careful that they might not have had the exposure that you would expect, and therefore just treat that with a little bit of care. And other options to reduce the challenge, well, of course, we've got breeding, and we haven't got time to go into that tonight, but there's some really good work been going on, particularly the Glynns have been working very hard on this to attempt to breed, or they are doing, I mean, they're improving their FECs now, so they've got females that are producing fewer eggs in the first place on the pasture, and of course, the rams that you then use and breed from are going to produce down the generations animals that are going to be producing less in terms of contamination. And don't forget nutrition. Nutrition is really important. I'm currently doing some work at the moment where I'm looking at the paraparturient rise in ewes of the group in Wales, and it's really interesting to see the difference between the farms and the difference, because I know which ones are under a bit more pressure. And where the feeding has gone really, really well, the paraparturient rise is nothing like as high as where perhaps they're under a bit more challenge. So don't underestimate the fact that nutrition and immunity are really important. Finally, just one point to make, and I know I'm running out of time, Chloe, so just give me another couple of minutes just to run through this. It's not time yet, but I really want to encourage you at this stage to be thinking about using a group 4 or a group 5 wormer as an integral part of your lamb treatments in the mid-late season. So a one-off dose later in the season. Please don't leave these on the shelf till the others are broken. If you do, you'll run into the trouble that I think 3 flocks in the UK now have had resistance to the group 4s, and in all cases it's because they've got triple resistance and they have used the group 4 time after time after time because their options are now very limited. So please don't do that. Use these 2 groups as so from weaning onwards, the later you leave it, the better. And just one slide to explain to you why that is. So again, we've got our little lamb on the left here, and he's got a mixed population of worms, and we're probably going to drench him. We might drench him once, in which case, pretend it's the same one on the right, he's left with resistant worms, a few. We drench him again, and he's still got a few more resistant worms. And then we might drench a 3rd time, perhaps around about weaning, and he's got even more resistant worms in him. Because what people don't realise is that worms will stay alive in a lamb for several months, happily producing eggs and carrying on and really enjoying life. If their susceptible mates are all being killed off, they are being given advantage over everybody else. So the idea of using a group 4 or 5, for which there is very obviously no evidence of resistance to a group 5 and virtually nothing for the 4 ADs, sorry, come back to that, is to be able to go in and knock out that population of resistant worms that is built up in that lamb over the season. 2 advantages. One, it gets rid of them and resets the clock a little bit in terms of your status on the farm to where you started in the season. And secondly, of course, that lamb's not really going to want to carry that burden of worms that should have been killed. So it is going to improve its performance further down the line. So please do consider that, and again, we'll take some questions on that if we need to. So, in summary, I hope I haven't gabbled too much. This is a subject that I spent half my life on, and therefore to try and get it into half an hour is quite a challenge. So measure some performance benchmarks, just how is it going, and then you can measure your worm control and everything else against it. Where do you want to be? Use fecal egg counts in lambs and calves, determine the need to treat, to check that treatment has worked, and also to track contamination. 3 really important ways you can use the fecal egg count. Avoid and reduce that worm challenge for Youngstock when possible, particularly when we meet that crescendo in the mid-season. Let's try and avoid it. When we're using antibiotics, let's please make sure it's as effective as possible. Get the best from every dose, and also test. Make sure you're using one which is likely to be effective. Choose your products carefully. There's lots of information. Go on those websites. It's all there, and they're all in downloadable format. When it comes to lambs, use a group 4 or 5 product in the mid to late season. I know they're more expensive, but this is where you will see the benefit. And I know I'm sure people, and there'll be vets online tonight as well, vets and SQPs will be able to talk you through that, and we'll know of people who've had a good experience. And understand that immunity is also important, and we need to let them develop that, get the nutrition right and encourage it, and that will also help to reduce our reliance on antibiotics. Okay, Chloe.
Thank you very much, Lesley. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I'd just like to remind everyone that the presentation has been recorded and it will be on the AHDB YouTube channel. And if you'd like any more information on sheep, then please visit the SCOPS website at scops.org.uk. And for cattle, it's the COWS website at cattleparasites.org.uk. So Lesley, the first question is, once you've treated, how long does it take for all of the worms to get out of the system?
Well, generally speaking, if you want it, we normally would say about 48 hours to actually get them out of the system. Depends what you use. So if it's a 2LB, it's not going to take very long because it works very quickly. But for the white and the clears, it's going to take a little bit longer.
Thank you. We've got another one here. Should we just worm lambs as and when they get dirty rather than a blanket worm?
No, I mean, there are two questions in that really, aren't there? I think waiting to decide whether or not you need to treat until they get dirty, that's what we all used to do, let's face it. And sometimes people get a bit disappointed because they'll go in there and they'll see dirty lambs, get a high FEC and say, well, I was going to do them anyway. But there can be other reasons for lambs to get dirty. So just be careful of that one. What I would say is when you're taking a fecal egg count, it's really important, I said, to take them at random. So don't do what some people have done in the past and gone in and said, oh, well, I've only taken samples from the loose ones, the dirty ones, or I've only taken samples from the ones from really pelleted. It's important to get a random sample because otherwise you will skew the result. The other part of that question, I think, relates to the fact that you don't want to be blanket treating lambs. And that, again, that's slightly different. In that what we're trying to do now, particularly now we've got EID and auto weighing systems, we can weigh lambs in a lot of farms a lot more easily, is that what we can do is we can use growth rate as an indicator as whether or not they need worming. So those lambs that are performing really, really well and are doing great growth rates, we generally don't need to worm, we can leave them, and we can actually concentrate the effort on the ones that are doing less well. So there's two questions in there really.
Thanks, Lesley. And we've got another one here. Can eggs shed by overwintering sheep then infect grazing calves this summer?
No, not from sheep to calves. So there isn't any carryover. They are different species. So if there's been sheep on the pasture over the winter, then it won't infect the calves. The exception there, of course, I know we're talking about worms tonight, but the exception there would be liver fluke, because liver fluke obviously is common to both species. And you've just reminded me with that question to say to people that it's really important now, as far as liver fluke is concerned, to think about your ewes and cattle and think about testing to see whether or not they have still got mature fluke in them, and treating them with an adulticide. So not with one that kills immatures, but this stage just an adulticide, so oxyclocinide or a high dose of a white drench. So that basically not for the animal, but to prevent that contamination for further on. So, but the normal roundworm species, there isn't a crossover.
Thanks, Lesley. And what is the cost typically of doing a fecal egg count?
Oh, good question. And it varies tremendously. So at the top end, you'll be looking at just over £20 to do a fecal egg count. I think, and I say I think, but I think the merchant fecal egg counts are round about, you can get those, some of those for about £5. Vet practices sometimes will have a package, and it will be maybe, I don't know, somewhere 5 to 15, depending on what the package is. So I think that you need to look at your alternatives. Obviously DIY a decent microscope and a slide is maybe going to set you back £300 or £400 or something, but then there's no cost after that.
Thanks, Lesley. We've got another one here. These people say they've treated last week for nematodirus after a FEC and positive identification from the vet. They're doing rotational grazing and they've now moved the mothers and the lambs twice since treatment. Do they need to be careful that those blocks of land, when they come back to them either later on or next year?
Well, next year for nematodirus certainly, because the lambs, they will have been dropping those nematodirus eggs, and those nematodirus eggs will sit there and wait for lambs to come back next year. So from a nematodirus point of view, yes, definitely that block of land you should have sort of logged into your memory map, that is likely to be somewhere where you'd expect to see nematodirus next year. What would be quite good is whoever that was, I forget how long you said it was now, Chloe, but to test that the white drench is still working for nematodirus, you need to take a fecal egg count about 8 or 9 days after treatment. So you might have just gone over that window now, but that would be really useful.
Thanks, Lesley. And what age should I start using FEC for lambs?
As an age, generally, probably about 6 weeks, because bear in mind, you saw those little lambs in my video. They were just over a fortnight old when they were munching away quite a moment. And you could act, and there wasn't any sound on that. They were really going for it. They were munching it. And then, of course, those lambs, those larvae will settle, and then you'll start to get an egg count, and the worms will start to build up. So about 6 weeks, but it does depend when the lambs were born, because you can get lambs that were born early and turned out early where there isn't really very much worm activity. So it might be that they'd be a little bit later, but about 6 weeks. For most people, about now actually, Chloe, which obviously was partly why we decided to go for now for this webinar.
Thanks, Lesley. That's really helpful. And how long does larvae survive on top of pasture for?
It depends on the weather conditions, to be honest. They don't survive that long if it comes really hot at the time. So what happens is they need quite a lot of moisture. So they won't live for that long in that drop of water, and as soon as that dries out, they're gone. Okay, so difficult to put an actual time on it. But what also tends to happen is if it goes dry, they just sit in the dung pats. So they don't get past the dung pat stages. And then what happens is as soon as the water comes, they all rush out and they're up there waving themselves around to be eaten. So they tend not to get caught too much. You know, the ones that are up there will die. The eggs that get put down in a dry period just sit there in the dung and they will wait.
Thank you, Lesley. We've got another question here. We are thinking of buying quite a lot of store lambs this summer. What are your thoughts on the threat of Barber's poleworm, which has been so virulent in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're buying in any sheep, as people will know, we do recommend that you go through a quarantine treatment. But for me, one of the main things as well for a quarantine treatment is to make sure you don't buy in the Barber's poleworm. If you haven't got it, you really do not want it, because it is quite unpredictable and difficult to manage, and also very prone to building resistance ahead of other worm species. So I would strongly recommend that if you're buying in store lambs, that you do actually quarantine treat them with either a group 4 or a group 5, because that will take out the Barber's pole, the homunculus worms, and you know, get rid of the issue.
Thanks, Lesley. I've got another question here. Why did you say that the story on the bioactive foragers is a bit fuzzy at the moment?
Because I mean, I've done some work with chicory and lots of other people have, and actually in terms of its anthelmintic properties, I think it would be fair to say the jury is out. I've done some work and I have seen some of the highest worm counts I have ever seen on a clover chicory sward. So I am quite nervous to be pushing it hard in terms of anthelmintic properties. I think it's more likely In a wet time, it probably works better because those little larvae find it really difficult to climb up a chicory leaf. And they need the more hairy. You saw that you know, you can imagine them trying to climb up a chicory leaf and sit there in a drop of water. It's more difficult. But yeah, I would be very hesitant these days to be pushing the bioactives as for their anthelmintic properties. I'm very happy for people to look at them from the nutritional properties, and there are big advantages there.
Thank you. And the next question is, on an all-sheep farm, what EPG is the threshold for worming for the first dose and then each one after that?
Oh, I wish that was an easy one. Okay, so bear in mind what we're looking at with the fecal egg count. So what we're saying is that we are measuring the number of adults, which is a direct reflection of how many larvae they ate 3 weeks ago. So it would depend on how old the lamb is. And you know, whether or not you're going to start drawing. Generally speaking, at this time of year, I would be looking for an EPG. If I've really got to be pushed, I would be looking at an EPG of 400 to 500, and I would be thinking in terms of treating at that point. But it may be if it came in at 300, as I was saying earlier on, and we just had a flush of rain, and I'm thinking, do you know what, actually these lambs have probably eaten one hell of a lot of larvae in the last 10 days. I would personally, with what I knew of the farm, might be thinking of bringing that down a little bit. So you've got to think about the wider implications, not just the EPG, because it isn't that precise an art. Look at the EPG, ask yourself, how old are these lambs? How much exposure have they had? How much exposure have they had since this lot of worms were eaten? And where are they likely to be going next? You've got to take in those wider considerations.
Thanks, Lesley. And on a similar subject, in a very high EPG, can groups 4 and 5 drenches be used more than once per season?
I would prefer that people didn't. I mean, I think this comes back to, I mean, obviously, if you've done your testing and you know that you've got resistance to 2 or more of the other groups, then that might put a slightly different complexion on it. But to be frank, what you find with resistance is that what you tend to get is different groups resistant in different species of worms, and therefore at different times of year. So even when people say they've got triple resistance, actually, if you know what you can use when successfully, you can manage your way around it and still only use those 2 groups in the mid to late season. And I would hang on by my skin of my teeth to keep them to that, and as a quarantine drench, because we really mustn't overload those. Just because of the high EPG doesn't mean that you need to use those. You need to make sure that how well the others are working.
Thanks, Lesley. And does dose and move apply to all worm groups? What about leaving a percentage unwormed? Would you do that for groups 4 and 5?
Yes, yes, I would. I think, you know, and when you get later in the season, although if you're going to be putting animals back on the same pasture, so the trick with this is if you're going to treat and you're putting them back onto the same pasture and it's contaminated, then any remaining worms will get diluted out very, very quickly. It's when you're on these low challenge situations. So even if you're using a group 4 and 5, it's still good practice to leave a few undrenched, and then you would just leave the top animals that are doing the best and will have a low egg count anyway. Their immunity is kicking in, they're doing very well, thank you very much. And I would still be trying to leave some of those.
Thanks, Lesley. We've got another one here. Can we reduce the challenge by taking a hay crop from our grazing fields, and does topping reduce the challenge as well?
You can certainly reduce the challenge by taking a hay crop. So, you know, if you're not going to have, it's not going to be clean, but if you've been grazing ewes and lambs, for example, and you now think about shutting it up, shut it up, take a hay crop. then if you can imagine my red and green graph with that great big hump of infection, then obviously what you're doing is you're flattening that out. So there will still be worms there later in the season, but there will be a lot fewer. So that's better. In terms of topping, not really. It might, if the problem with topping, one of the downsides of topping, of course, is in a dry time, it's better not to do that because you're losing your moisture. So from a worm point of view, though, by topping, you are drying things out a little bit. So you might get rid of some of the little blighters, but I wouldn't have thought that it had any other practical use, to be honest. The worms they're very clever. They'll be there waiting for their next opportunity.
Thank you. And is there any situation when you would worm suckler cows?
In a word, no. I mean, suckler calves in the autumn, if they need it on housing, that would be a different thing. But again, I would really say, look, do some fecal egg counts and see if they actually need it. I can't think of an instance when I would want to actually worm suckler cows. Yeah, good question though.
What would you think about housing, Lesley? Would that be a time or not?
Not if they don't need it. I mean, I think there is this temptation to think, oh, well, we're housing cattle, therefore we've got to do everything to them. I mean, certainly liver fluke is a different question at all if you've got a liver fluke situation, and ectoparasites may well be a different thing again. But actually, an adult suckler cow is just like an adult ewe. She has a small resident population of worms that she carries around that just keeps her immune system tuned nicely. And really, she doesn't need that. She doesn't need or want that interrupting.
Thank you, Lesley. We've got another one here. How often should you replace your drench gun?
More often than we do. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, there's a big debate goes on. Well, should we have free ones and throw them away regularly? But then people tend not to do that. You should replace it when it reaches the point where it is no longer working properly. And it will work properly better if after every time we use it, we clean it with hot soapy water and look after it. If we chuck it in the corner, filthy, horrible, dirty, and don't look after it and don't replace the seals, then it's going to need replacing more often. And if you put a mineral drench through it, like I did through my very expensive Philips, it won't last very long at all.
Thank you. We've got a comment here. They've seen a merchant is advertising a worming bucket. What are your thoughts about these, please?
I better be careful here, aren't I? I suppose you want me to be honest, not a lot. I worry about this because let's think back to what we were saying. I mean, one of the major risks for anthelmintic resistance development is exposure, lethal exposure of worms to the anthelmintic. And the problem with buckets generally is, no matter whether it's for a so-called medicated reason or nutritional, is that it's the old 80-20 rule. So 80% gets taken by 20% of the animals, and the rest are not getting a therapeutic dose. So it is actually a concern that they're nibbling away at it and all they're doing is sublethally exposing the worms and encouraging resistance, I'm afraid. So I would be very nervous about those.
Thanks, Lesley. And we've just got a couple more questions left. I know we're not talking about liver fluke tonight, but how would you test for liver fluke?
Right, okay. At the moment, then, for liver fluke, it would be a simple fecal egg count again. Bear in mind, you've got to ask for liver fluke because it's a completely different test. Actually, you've got to float the eggs out. And it tends to be that they need a slightly bigger sample as well. So have a word with whoever you're sending it to. So at the moment, we will be looking at fecal egg counts. You can also use copper antigen, which again is a fecal test. And that we tend to use probably more earlier on because we don't actually need the fluke to be completely adult to pick them up because we can pick up the antigen. The other ways that we've got in cattle, you can use a milk test, so you can test for antigens in milk, and obviously a lot of dairy producers use that. And we also have an ELISA test, but we wouldn't tend to use the ELISA test, which is a blood test looking at antibodies at this time of year, because we can't tell when the animals were infected, so their antibody levels will tend to stay up. So at the moment, I would say you'd be looking at either a copper antigen test or a fecal egg count test to say whether or not your animals had still got some fluke in them and you needed to use, but remember, use an adulticide at this time of year.
Thanks, Lesley. And the next one is, if you're rotationally grazing, when would you put the ewes back onto that first field again? So I presume this is from a worm control point of view.
Oh, I mean, I think you have to just set aside the worm control issue as far as the rotational grazing is concerned. So if you're rotational grazing, paddock grazing, you're really doing that from the point of view of optimizing your dry matter utilization and the quality of that dry matter that the animals are eating, and really set aside anything to do with worm control, because you can't second guess how long and what rotation that's going to be on, and whether it's going to coincide with a lot of the larvae having died out, so a low level, or indeed you're putting those lambs right back into a wall of larvae because the timing just happens to be right. So I would say those systems, obviously we really encourage those now because of the point of view of the nutritional advantages and that, you know, potential two tons of dry matter per hectare that you've got by managing your grazing that well, and use your fecal egg counts to see what's happening in your animals. You might then be able to say, well, on that paddock we had a massive fecal egg count at such and such a time, and you might want to just fiddle around with your rotations, but to be honest, it's really more a question of managing the pasture.
Thanks, Lesley. 2 questions left. Which wormer groups have shown resistance in cattle?
Oh, well, I mean, you will find resistance in cattle, certainly in the group 1s and the group 3s. I'd be very surprised if you didn't find something in the others, but groups 1 and group 3, you're starting to get me into an area now where I'm not a cattle specialist, but certainly if you go looking for it, you'll find it.
Thanks, Lesley. And the final question for this evening, is there any crossover in worm species between sheep, goats and horses?
Oh, sheep and goats, most certainly there is. As a general tip, don't ever graze sheep and goats together or have them grazing the same pasture at different times, because unfortunately they do have the same worm species, and goats do not react or handle anthelmintics very well, and so they do tend to accelerate resistance massively. So I'm not a goat hater, don't get me wrong, but they are a bit of a nightmare really when it comes to resistance with sheep, so be very careful with any goat and sheep. With horses, no, but bear in mind that horses can get liver fluke.
Oh, thank you, Lesley. That's an interesting point to end on.
Yeah, there's been some more recent work on that actually, and I haven't taken it in now, but there's been some more recent work on, I think Liverpool were doing some, but horses, human beings can get liver fluke, of course, if we, you know, go eating infected watercress, but well, certainly horses are not, you know, they can get it.
Thank you. Thanks, that's really good points. I know quite a few farms have gone into livery yards now, so that's good to know. So thanks very much for your presentation tonight, Lesley. It's been great and we've covered lots of ground, and thank you to everyone at home for listening. I would like to remind you that the presentation has been recorded, so it's available on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channel along with other previous webinars. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your evenings, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.